Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, monomiliwanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so honored and so delighted that you'll join us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show. And please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Good Pods, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Kay O'Neill. Kay is here to celebrate the Moth Keeper. Before we invite Kay into the studio to celebrate this wonderful graphic novel, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by Lucas and the Game of Chance, an exciting middle grade novel by Anthony Manna. It is a Reading with Your Kids certified great read. While Lucas is playing his flute at the seawall one day, he befriends a mysterious, talking, dancing snake that rewards him with fortune and favor. Some years later, tempted by greed and pride, Lucas loses all of his riches and his family. He must now set off on a treacherous journey through a frightening forest filled with suspense and strange creatures to find Destiny, her son Ilion, the sun, and her daughter Luna, the moon. These celestial gardens will surely allow him to reverse his misfortune, restore his honor, and win back all that he loves and treasures. Won't they? A reimagined Greek folktale, Lucas and the Game of Chance, is illustrated with dramatic and evocative pen and ink drawings that provide an ideal backdrop for the dark intrigue that fills this haunting story of human struggle, courage, and resilience. You and your teens and tweens are going to love this book. It's Lucas and the Game of Chance by Anthony Manna. It is a Reading with Your Kids certified great read. Join us right now from the beautiful city of Christchurch in New Zealand. We are celebrating the release of the graphic novel, The Moth Keeper. Please welcome to the show, Kay O'Neill. Hey, Kay, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to have you on. Tell us all about the Moth Keepers, please.
So The Moth Keeper is a graphic novel for kids around sort of 8 to 12 or 13, and it's about a young girl called Ania who takes on the role of protecting a flock of magical moths that help her nocturnal community thrive. So it's a really important responsibility, and over time she comes to feel the isolation of the world around her, as well as, you know, having to take this on her shoulders. And it kind of explores the community around her, her role in that community, why she wanted to take on such a burden, and what the solution is if she's feeling this isolated. Is this something she really has to deal with all by herself?
You know, it's interesting that you're talking about Ania taking on this incredible responsibility. I feel like it's a common theme, I think, because a lot of kids see themselves taking on incredible responsibilities. And I think most of the time it's incredible responsibilities within the family. And it's not and it's not something that they're imagining. In a lot of families, it's the kids who are 12, 13, 14, 15 who are the glue that are keeping a lot of families together.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think it can be very hard for them to talk about the feeling of pressure and the feeling of burnout, because I think people often don't identify burnout as something that children experience, but they absolutely can, especially emotionally. And I think it can often be very hard to identify because it comes from a really good place. Like, they really want to help their family. They really want to take on these responsibilities. So that's a lot of what sort of Ania goes through in the book and struggles to sort of articulate.
Yeah. it's, as we're talking, I'm imagining the being a kid is really tough.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, but it seems a lot tougher because kids I think they find themselves on either end of a spectrum. Either they are taking on incredible responsibilities, or they're just kind of floating through life, not doing a whole lot of anything.
Yeah, that's true. And it's either one can sort of lead to, I guess, a lot of soul searching and, feeling of displacement. And so I think that's why community was a really important theme I wanted to deal with in this book, and how you can find a sense of worth and sort of self-direction from the community that you can build, that you can choose. It doesn't have to be the one that you're born into.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What was it that inspired this story?
Well, so as a graphic novel artist, I'm isolated quite a lot of the time in terms of what I do. If I don't make it, no one else is going to. I mean, a lot of authors, same thing, but graphic novels in particular are a lot of like physical labor. Drawing's like a really physical task to do. So when you draw 250 pages, you really do feel that sense of isolation. And so I think personally that's the source I drew on, but I also definitely was thinking a lot about things that as a child I took on and felt like I couldn't tell anyone. And looking back, if I'd simply just reached out and said, I'm struggling, someone could have helped me come to a solution. Like I didn't have to be just the only one sort of coping.
Yeah. And you mentioned creating illustrations for 250 pages. We're talking about a graphic novel, so there's 250 pages and then 4 or 5 panels. So we're talking, my math isn't really good. We're like thousands of illustrations.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
There's shortcuts and things, but
I'm not going to reveal her name, although she was very open and honest here on the podcast about this. We did have a graphic novelist come on the show, and when I asked her inspiration for lead character, she was very honest, and she said, well, I knew I was going to have to do about 1,000 illustrations, so I wanted to make it easy for myself. So I drew the illustration really simple so I could do it over and over.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same as, animation and things. There's a reason they don't, put like a bunch of patterns onto like the main characters usually.
Yeah. Now, when you're creating this graphic novel series, what came first? Were you tooling and kind of doodling around with a character and an image, and from that sprang the character and the story, or did you have the story and the image came after the story was in your mind?
I think for me, the visual always comes first. And so I had little sketches of like a little fennec fox holding a wee lantern in the desert with all these moths sort of coming around it. And I just really liked that visual image. I thought there was like lots to think about and explore, and maybe, I think it's kind of and it also, I think it comes from something I must have drawn as a child. Like it feels oddly nostalgic, even though I don't necessarily have any drawings from that time. I think that kind of concept of someone alone, but with this sort of flock of creatures surrounding them as a kind of guardian, I think that's something I was really compelled by as a kid. So I thought, other kids might find it interesting too.
Yeah. Do you feel that kids, or maybe yourself, as you were growing up, you kind of felt that, here I am, I'm a human being, but I don't feel like all these other human beings that are around me. I kind of feel isolated and alone, and I can kind of relate to them, but not completely?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's loads and loads of reasons that can happen. Like for children with like a different gender identity, the different sexuality, with just different, like a family situation that is very different from their peers. And there's just so many different reasons that children feel like they can't express their whole self to their peers. So I think, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, my poor kids grew up having a professional clown and magician as a dad.
Oh, what a burn.
I know. They felt really isolated. They're like, there's no one in the world like this. So when did you know that you wanted to express yourself as a graphic novelist?
I think it's kind of strange. I've never not drawn to express stories. And when I've drawn, it's always been characters. Like I wasn't drawing sort of, just a vase of flowers. I was always drawing like, the person in the room with the vase of flowers, like who is that person and things. So I think that came very naturally. And I remember the first time I read a graphic novel that really like made me realize that that's kind of the style I want to go for, like in terms of like, you can actually just tell a whole story through pictures. And it's like, I don't need to convince Walt Disney to make this visual medium, this visual storytelling, which is like, obviously there's lots of barriers to entry there, but actually the barriers to entry for comics is really low. And it's been really fun getting like feedback from kids who are like starting to make their own. Like they can kind of see it, and it's like it's right there on the page. Like they're like, I can draw that. Like I can draw a page of artwork. And even the tools I use, like I use an old iPad and an application that costs about $15, and that's what I use for all of my books. So it's really exciting to be able to like tell kids that it's as simple as that. And sometimes kids come to like workshops and they've got the exact same stuff, and they're already getting into it. It's so awesome.
That's really is fantastic. We do live in an age that is really incredible. The idea that, practically anybody in the world has the ability to create a story, to create a graphic novel, to create some kind of art, music, and have a way to get it out there to the world. Now, there's lots of songs, lots of podcasts out there that are out there that don't get to the world. There's a lot of work and marketing and whatnot. But just the ability that I have a way to get this onto something where somebody in New Zealand or Indonesia or the United States or wherever can access it and download it. It's, growing up almost 100 years ago, it's hard for me to even wrap my head around that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I grew up like with, I think, maybe I was about 10 or 11 when we got the internet. So I did have a period before that where things were just mysteriously made somewhere else, and that was some kind of like forbidden realm. So it's been really fun to see it just becoming much more and more accessible.
Yeah. Now you're mentioning that for you the images come before the words, the story. Do you find yourself actually creating a whole series of panels that get into the story before you start putting words to it?
I think it will usually, sometimes I do. Sometimes there's a clear sequence, almost like an animation storyboard going through like several sort of scenes or something. But often it's more an image and then dialogue, because I think rather than thinking in terms of description, which I do because my editor needs to be able to read my script and understand what is happening. But I think it goes like picture, then dialogue, and that's the closest I can condense things down to those two elements, like the happiest and like the most sort of connected I feel to a project.
Yeah. One of the things, and I can't continue to remind listeners of my mistake because I don't want them to make the same mistake as I did. I didn't appreciate when my now adult son, who is awesome and is here in Boston helping me deal with my current physical ailment. When he was younger, he was really into anime and manga and graphic novels, and I supported it. We went out and we helped him get the different graphic novels and whatnot. But I didn't appreciate the fact that what he was reading was literature, and that he was actually reading. And so there were many nights that I would go into his room and just go, dude, can you please read a book without a picture in it? And that was a mistake because, again, graphic novels are literature. There's reading. There's real meat to those stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really common mistake because I think also like, there is a history of comics that were simply produced to, for the lowest form of entertainment for children. Like they weren't assuming children were smart, and they weren't assuming that children like to read, whereas now books do know those things, and that they can provide this whole other form of literacy that you actually can't get from a book, because you're reading faces and you're reading expressions, and you're kind of like, I mean, it's similar to like watching a film or watching an animated show, but it gives children a chance to go at their own pace, whereas a movie will kind of flash by things. Like a child can come back to a book several times and be like, I don't really understand that, and then maybe the third or fourth time they read it, they're like, oh, that's what that character means, or it's like up to them to decide. So it's really nice.
Yeah. Now, you were sharing with me earlier that before the Moth Keepers, there was the Dragon Society.
The Tea Dragon Society.
Tea Dragon Society. Oh, yeah, look at that. I wrote the instead of Tea Dragon. So tell us a little bit about the Tea Dragon Society.
So that's a series of books, and I think that can be read for like much younger ages as well. I often get people saying that they read with their sort of 3 to 4 year olds, even though they won't understand everything. They just, because the drawings are there, it's like it allows them to engage and they can see the world in it. So it's about a couple of children who discover the lost or sort of dying art of caring for these tea dragons, which are these small, very fussy dragons, similar to like a pedigree cat, but they grow tea leaves out of their horns of certain kinds of tea. And when you brew the tea and drink it, you experience the memories that the dragon has absorbed with its owner, who's cared for it and, you know, dedicated their life and energy to it. So it's kind of like these strange, slightly annoying companions that are quite cute and lovable, and it's just about the community that grows around it, as well as like why it might be worthwhile to preserve things that are difficult to do, and maybe, you know, considered like old-fashioned or slow, or like an old way of doing things, and like lost arts and things.
Very
so just
cool.
giving kids an intro to that.
Yeah. One of it sounds like the Tea Dragon Society would be a really fun experience for families to take a picture walk through. And before you read the dialogue, just take a look at the pictures and talk about them and say, what do you think's going on here? And what's that growing out of the dragon's head? Oh my goodness, I can't wait to find out what it really is. And just have those kind of discussions.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's definitely one of the things I really strive for, is to create lots of like interesting detail and little background things as well for people to notice that's like not directly addressed. And I think that's one of the really fun things about graphic novels, is that you can create this kind of visual experience with lots to find that you don't have to draw attention to, and maybe some kids will notice and some kids won't.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, I've heard, so I was sharing with Kay before before we started recording that I have a couple of friends from New Zealand, one that's living here in the States, a couple that are back there, and I've quote unquote visited New Zealand through different films that a lot of us have experienced, and it just seems to be a slightly magical place, and I hear that you know, it's a society, it's small, but they get to try all the really cool tech things before the rest of us do, because they are so small, and so it's really easy to experiment with stuff over there. But how do you think growing up in New Zealand and living in New Zealand affected the Moth Keeper? Do you think that is a story that you would have written no matter where you grew up?
I'm not sure. It's very hard to say, because I think being in a country like New Zealand does form, you know, me in a way that would be very different than America. And for instance, we have free healthcare, we have subsidized tertiary education. There's so many things that I've experienced growing up here that I wouldn't have otherwise. But also the fact that there's fewer people in New Zealand than there are in Manhattan. Like, it's a very, very, very small country. It's really funny when, like, you know, as you were saying before the podcast, like, your friend is the mayor of a town that's just beside mine. It's like, it's so funny that, like, the kind of, there's like a stereotype that if you're like meeting another New Zealander overseas, you'll know them somehow, but it's honestly true most of the time. So I think the sense of like community and but also just like a respect for nature. I always try and include like a really strong natural element and like thinking of ways we can live better with nature. There's like a really strong kind of green community here of like, you know, people wanting to find better practices, as well as some really unethical farming too. So we've got a long way to go. It's definitely not actually a perfect sort of hobbit land, but I think there's really good ideas and really good people doing amazing work in New Zealand.
Awesome. Well, no place is perfect, and no people are perfect. You know what would be a perfect idea right now is for you to tell us where we can go to find out more about the Moth Keepers and also more about you.
So I'm kind of on social media. If you look me up, it is Strangely Katie on Instagram and Twitter. And the books will be available from Penguin Random House. And at your local bookshop. That's the best place. Yeah, always. Yeah.
I love it. And you can go and chances are, you know, bookshops aren't able to stock every single book, but if you go there and you ask nicely and you say, hey, do you have the Moth Keeper? It's a great graphic novel by Kay O'Neill. If they don't have it there that day, they can make a phone call and it'll be there in a day or two.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people don't realize that you can just ask for books and they will happily find them. In fact, indie bookstores tend to be really good at that. So that's a big reason to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And libraries too. You absolutely can request books at your library. We've had a great time speaking to the author and illustrator of The Moth Keeper, a great graphic novel from our guest, Kay O'Neill. Hey, Kay, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading With Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Kate Fussner. She'll be here. We hope you will be here as well. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, we're going to start by thanking our guest, Kay O'Neill. Please be sure to check out The Moth Keeper. I also want to thank our sponsor, Lucas and the Game of Chance. A thrilling middle grade novel written by our friend Anthony Manna. It is a Reading With Your Kids certified great read. I also want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Madison Dieris, Monica Rivera Sosa, Ann O'Leary, Soji Franklin. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.